Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I will be discussing Dragon Mage by M.L. Spencer. It's a beautiful cover here. And this was originally a standalone book, but has now been said that this is going to be the first of a series. I've been meaning to film this review for quite some time now, so I'm happy to finally get to it because I do have a lot of things that I want to say about this one. And so let's just jump into talking about Dragon Mage. So Dragon Mage is set up initially as a very classic feeling fantasy type story. We have, the young boy who's in a small village, finds out he has a destiny, adventure and danger and everything comes. But it is actually manages to be extremely unique for a couple of different reasons. The first one being the main character Aram, and the second being the way the world is actually set up does definitely give some uniqueness to it as well. So first let's talk about Aram, because Aram is a different kind of character that I don't think I've ever actually read to the extent here, being that he is very much, through the text, it's visible that he is on the spectrum and seems to have a lot of tendencies of somebody who has autism. And so this was something that was really, really different because you don't typically get a main character like that. You occasionally will have, some characters or whatnot. There's even some that have become a negative trope that have appeared in some fantasy stories or in popular media in general. This is completely different. Aram is very much the main character, and the fact that he's on the spectrum and or has autism is very much important to the story. But what it did, and the thing that really hooked me on this book right away, is the fact that even if we're looking at kind of some classic fantasy things or, these basic things to set up a story, everything that occurs, we're seeing it in a completely different fashion because Aram is a different kind of character. He's not just the standard farm boy. He sees the world in a completely different way than other people. And so you, in turn, through his eyes, are seeing the story in a very different way. That worked really, really well for me, just right off the bat immediately because of all of these little things that were set up that way. It did make sense with the story too, because we come to find out that it's very early on, it's mentioned that he's pretty much obsessed with knots, and the magic system in this book has quite a lot to do with like knots and tying knots and everything to basically weave the fabric of the earth or magic in general. And so not only in just his interactions with other people in his story, but with the magic as well, it's highly relevant. And so it really, like I said, it just it was like reading a story that you read before and going back to having it be the first time. There were a lot of familiar elements, especially early on. So much of it felt so fresh and different because of the fact that we were seeing it a really different way. The second thing, like I mentioned, is the world building, kind of the setup here, because this story takes place where we have the world above and the world below, and basically legend has it essentially that the worlds were separated. They were originally one world, but they were sundered as part of like a great magical war. And so in the world above, they don't have the natural essence that is essentially magic, because that is all like magic, and all magical beings were essentially put in the world below, separated there. And so there are these kind of like sorcerers called Exilari, and they can only do magic by getting the essence from people who produce their own, that are, born, and the essence is kind of running out because, generally the magic users were confined to the world below, and so they, that kind of is the big push of what's going on there as they're pushing for magic. And it's kind of different too, because like the world below isn't like the underworld or anything like that. It's just basically it's two different sides, and neither one of them is 100% good or evil in some ways, because there are definitely evil that are in the world below, and there's lots of good people as well. And then we have the evil people and the regular people that are in the world above. So it's kind of looking at that war between, and then you also have like the Aether realm in between, called the Void, where like you can get trapped and there are creatures and void walkers there. So there's a lot of really interesting things that are set up as a part of that. And so the world itself I found very interesting, and just the way the story is told through Aram I also found very, very interesting also. So I really enjoyed this book, and this is definitely something I highly recommend. There are some flaws, though, and I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. The first big one for me is that there are multiple times throughout where it feels like things are really rushed along to very quickly move to the next point in the book. This happens early on where we have some things happening, and then just very suddenly, it's like the authors just said, okay, we need to be done with this part, we're moving on to this part, so this is just going to kind of happen. And this happened a little bit later in the book, too, with some like moments that I felt like should have been really, really big moments, and I was really kind of wanting more out of. They weren't written poorly, just written very quickly. And so there were a few times with that where I just felt like certain parts that should have been more important seemed like they were glossed over a little bit more. And so there were certain scenes, especially where I had worked up, I'd been like, waiting, and then it's just kind of over very, very quickly over a couple of pages instead of being a longer passage. So I was looking for more there. With a book too, and the thing I just talked about too, I feel like that is characteristic of a standalone. Like I said, when this was written, it was a standalone, and then it was commented that there are going to be more, but that's something I've noticed sometimes in a standalone, it's you have to move quickly. The thing is, this is not a short book. I mean, this is, the print is not particularly small by any means, but I mean, this is, the physical edition's over 800 pages. It's like, this is not a small book. I really do feel like the author had time to write those passages and spend a little bit more time there, and maybe spend a little bit less time with some other things. So that's kind of where, with it being as long as it was, I would have liked to spend a little bit more time there. But overall, the story was done very well, and it was very satisfying and really well written. So despite that being a complaint, it did knock my rating down just a little bit. It still wasn't anything that was, a deal breaker for me with this book. There were, the only other really, complaint I have is there were some times where characters seemed to be a little inconsistent. There was one particular character who early on just kind of seemed to ping pong between who he was, personality-wise, and so that seemed a little bit strange. But the other thing, and it's kind of inexplicable, and I don't know why, but there were several times where a character, usually Aram, would discover something or find something out and directly comment about how he'd never known that before, or he'd never heard that before, despite the fact that earlier in the story he literally had found out these things, or had been told them, didn't really have a huge reaction, and then later on, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I'm yeah, 2 chapters ago someone told you the same thing. And so that happened just a couple of times. That really did annoy me, probably more than anything, because I'm a nitpicky guy. But once again, it wasn't a huge deal. I think part of it is just pieces there with this being a newer author. This isn't M.L. Spencer's first book, but definitely with this being a big fantasy epic. When you're writing your first book like this, there's usually going to be some show that you're a newer author, or that you're still kind of figuring things out. And so I think this was really, really well done. Despite those things, I definitely get why this was really hyped up as one of the big self-pub books to read. And it's something, like I said, I enjoyed immensely, despite those complaints. I feel like the characters, for the most part, they weren't insanely strong characters, but they definitely weren't weak characters. Of the main 2 characters, Aram and Marcus, really, they were kind of the forefront. There were some other characters that were developed more as well. Once again, I feel like because of the fact that it was a standalone, it was more focused on our main characters. And usually in a series, you can spend a little bit more time developing other characters because, you have time to do more later. So I do feel like it'd be really interesting to see how this book would have been different if it had been a planned series from the get-go instead of being planned as a standalone, because this really does feel like a standalone book. With the ending, too, it doesn't feel like, I'm sure there's plenty more things to do. And just with the story in this book, I can definitely think of plot lines that would happen in later books in the series. But it's written to be quite complete, which is a positive thing. You can read this as a standalone. There's no, cliffhanger. You're not going to be like, oh my gosh, I have to get to the next book immediately. This does work as a standalone and works with that. And once again, I've just found, and it's not all standalones, and it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but usually with the standalone, you've got to expedite things a little bit. Once again, this is a pretty long book, but that's how I felt some of those things went. Aram and Marcus's relationship too. So Aram, I already mentioned the main character, and Marcus is another boy from his village who ends up becoming kind of a protector to him. And so seeing the way that they interact, the way that they grow to care for each other and just try to figure each other out, because Aram once again sees the world in a really different way. There's a lot of times with like social cues or just telling how people are feeling. They're not things that he can really fully do. And so a lot is done, and it just kind of makes the fact that they are coming through like they have a barrier kind of between them because they both see things very differently. The fact that they become so close, I just thought worked really, really fantastically as well. There were a lot of moments too with just Aram where it's very like sad, like finding things out about his history or seeing things that he's going through that you can most certainly feel for the character also. One thing I do specifically want to mention, and I kind of touched on this toward the beginning, is Aram is, and I'm just going to say, an autistic character, which I'm by no means an expert on, like, the technical terms for the spectrum. It does, from what I know, several specific things behaviors he exhibits, or like the way things are stated in the book, does sound like autism to me, so I'm just going to go with that because it's easier to say than on the spectrum every single time. So with some of his like autistic tendencies too, it's like the actual things aren't things that I can necessarily relate to personally, but it's very, very easy to relate to him as a character and kind of to see the things he's going through and how sometimes really simple things are the bigger challenges for him. He's really great at other things, and he's, his other qualities, like with being brave and dutiful, those are things that just seem like, oh, he doesn't understand why people would think he's doing something special. He's just doing what he thinks he's supposed to do. But, something like eating a meal that's not specifically carefully arranged in the exact way that is pleasing to him, that's something that's like an insurmountable obstacle almost. And so it just really gives you a different viewpoint. And I really liked the way that was handled with, Aram is not at all like a reluctant hero. That trope is really not used at all. He just is, honestly, he doesn't really have a lot of confidence because he's grown up ostracized and bullied because he was different. And he finds a place where in some ways he can belong, but also is still always going to be different for other reasons. And so seeing his struggles be more mundane, everyday things, and seeing the way that he handles the much bigger things, that just kind of contrast, I thought, also did a lot to make this feel like a very fresh story, so I enjoyed that. But at no point is Aram, being an autistic character, really played for like humor or laughs or like not taken seriously, and that's something I really appreciated here too. That's when I mentioned that, especially in media and in books too, a lot of times if you have like the autistic character, it's like, oh, they're really good at math, but they can't do anything else. So like, it's just this very narrow view of something that may potentially be something that an autistic person may have a specific trait, but it's like that's the only trait we're doing. Whereas Aram is an extremely well-rounded character. It does feel like M.L. Spencer was very careful to make sure that Aram wasn't just a trope by any means. He was a really, really well fleshed out character, and his like viewpoints and his tendencies and behaviors and the way he thought about things were explored quite a lot, and I really, really enjoyed that journey. It's just not something that you see, and I know I've said the word several times now, but this really did feel just fresh and kind of like a refreshing take on a classic fantasy story. Being very much a classic fantasy fan, I really enjoy a lot of classic fantasy. This book, to me, did the thing that you see a lot of other, you'll see books that have blurbs that say like, oh, it's a fresh take on this, or it's a fresh take on that. And a lot of those that I read, I'm like, not really. It's like either the same story with like one random different element, or like it's got, this gimmick there to make it a little bit different. And it's not quite the same. This, for me, really was the fresh take on a classic fantasy story, because the main element of Aram, and Aram being autistic, is really the big change. But that changes everything. Like I said, with the way you see the world through his eyes, through all of his POVs, it changes everything and takes what a lot of otherwise, despite the unique world building elements too, and parts there, a lot of this is, your kind of classic coming of age, tale. except that everything about it, once again, is a little bit different than what you've had before. So for me, this worked really, really well with the way the characters handled and the way the story followed a lot of classic fantasy parts. There were some differences in there too, and like I said, there were definitely some unique elements. But if you're a fan of classic fantasy, I really think you'll be a fan of this. People who are more into modern fantasy, not as into classic fantasy, may not enjoy this as much, because this is heart and soul classic fantasy, but it really is something different. So, you know, if your issue with classic fantasy is you feel like you've read it so many times before, because there are a lot of classic stories that really do have a lot of the same elements and the same tropes, this really did feel like something different. So if that's your reason for not really being a big classic fantasy fan, I still think you may enjoy this book, because it does feel so different and so refreshing in the classic fantasy space. So really, those are my thoughts on Dragon Mage. Like I said, I really, really enjoyed this. I thought this was a fantastic book, despite some flaws that it didn't have. I will definitely be continuing and reading the rest of the series, and I'm excited to see what M.L. Spencer does, especially as she continues to grow as an author and improve. And when I enjoy the first book I read by an author this much, that's really a good sign, because usually it's only going to go up. And so I'm excited to see what more comes from this. Let me know if you've read this book. I know this did kind of get around it, so quite a few people did. But once again, I do highly recommend it. I'm curious to hear any of your thoughts in the comments on what I said. If you agree or disagree with any of the things I said, or if you had different reactions to any of my reactions, always excited to have that conversation. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. And of course, check the link in the description for the Wizardly Duo Discord if you want to chat this book, other books, any books, or really just anything at all. It's a lot of fun, and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.